Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, industries such as insurance, finance and media, well, they've all found impactful ways to apply symbolic AI and deep machine learning to common pain points when it comes to taking unstructured language data from documents, social content and emails, etc. And by being able to take exact sentiment and the deeper meanings of words that normally only humans could ever do, language can now be turned into data, and from that, actionable insights for a wide range of use cases. And after discovering a company called Expert AI when researching this topic, I invited their CEO, Walt, onto the podcast today. And thankfully he said yes, and I invited him on to try and make sense of this complex world and obtain a better understanding of the actual business value that it can offer and get behind those buzzwords. So today, Walt's going to be joining us. He's going to be discussing the difference between symbolic AI and deep learning and machine learning, and to what kinds of use cases that they're typically applied to together, and what are the strengths of each, and what can organisations actually gain by combining them. And the plan is to do all that in a language that we can all understand. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Cape Cod in the US, where Walt is waiting to share his story and dive into the complex world of AI, machine learning, and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are, Walt, and what you do?
Of course, Neil, and thanks for having me on. I'm the CEO of Expert.ai, a software company that is uniquely focused on applying artificial intelligence to understanding language in a way that approximates how human beings understand language. It's an incredibly complex computational challenge, but it's one where we think we bring a unique set of capabilities. I joined Expert.ai 18 months ago, and I'm the first non-founder CEO. We were a classic kind of garage startup, but the garage was not located in Silicon Valley. It was located in Modena, Italy, in Emilia-Romagna, when a couple young students of computer science came together with this passion for applying technology to language. And they've grown the company up over time, and they were doing it before AI was all the buzz. They did it the old-fashioned way. They actually provided software that was worth more than it costs, and then slowly grew over time. But what's occurred in the last couple of years, Neil, is there's been a broader recognition of the power of artificial intelligence in the enterprise. And so with that, the founders and some investors were looking to scale the business. And given my background in high-growth businesses and in technology and working internationally, I was fortunate enough to have this opportunity.
Wow, what a great story. I'm curious about your own story too, because like you said, it is an incredibly complex world. And where did your passion for technology come from? And ultimately, what was it that put you on this path you're on today?
Well, I did not start in the technology world. Arguably, I started about as far away from the technology world as one could. Out of college, I actually entered the diplomatic corps of the United States government. And so I was a foreign service officer, and I served in various U.S. embassies around the world and diplomatic missions in very far-flung places like Bolivia and Pakistan and so forth. But what I recognized after not very long was that the entire global paradigm was shifting, and kind of all of the old models that applied for how we lived and conducted our lives were transforming in a really fundamental way. And the driver was technology. It was connecting us in ways that were not possible. It was breaking down barriers in ways that we did not previously imagine. And as I look forward over the balance of my professional and productive life, I thought, gosh, I really want to be where the action is. And so I made the conscious decision to leave the diplomatic world, and I went to business school, and I was very purposeful about going to work in the technology sector, initially with Dell. And given my international background, I very quickly kind of married those two streams and began to work internationally with Dell across Europe, Australia, Japan, and Singapore.
It's fascinating because I think I think over 1,800 people now, and everyone answers the question very similarly. That they didn't start out in technology, and like you said, you had that international background, and at the time you might have felt that was as far away from technology as you possibly could be. But of course, it really helped you, didn't it? It's like you've got that, you've learnt those skills and been given those skills for when you do need them, when you enter that world of tech. Almost like the universe gives you that little nudge when you need it to make sure you're in the right place at the right time.
Well, I think it's certainly been relevant in my current role, given the roots of Expert.ai in Italy, and the fact that we have this world-class engineering team in Italy. And Italy has had a historical and traditional strength in this very specific domain of applying technology and computational techniques to language. So it's really been quietly kind of the center of this really exciting field in technology, and more directly in artificial intelligence. And so knowing how to navigate across the cultures as we seek primarily to grow here in the United States over the next several years, my international experience, I think, has probably helped.
Absolutely. And as you said, that path has led you to Expert AI, and which is an artificial intelligence platform for language understanding. But for people that are tuning in and hearing about it for the first time, they could be listening anywhere in the world. Can you just tell them a little bit more about the kind of problems that you solve and what makes you different from other platforms that are out there at the moment?
Absolutely. So really core to what we do and what we focus on is language. And you'll often hear in the artificial intelligence world it referred to as natural language. And all that means is it's the language of human communication as opposed to a machine language. Say software code is machine language. Natural language is how you and I are exchanging data right now. It's how we encode our thoughts and then transmit it, receive it, interpret it, achieve meaning and insight from it, and then respond accordingly. So we are uniquely focused on language. And there's several clear reasons for that. One is language is a particularly complex and distinct form of data. So if you think about numbers, it's much, much different than language. And objects, for example, would be yet a third category. All of them represent data, but they come with very unique and complex requirements. So we believe that you have to focus on that particular domain. That's one. The other is we think it's important. To my earlier point, it's how we transmit data to each other. And finally, it is ubiquitous. It's pervasive. And one of the, I think, unexpected outgrowths of this digital revolution of the last 20 years, where we've had this incredible technology, what it's enabled us to do is to dramatically proliferate this form of data. So I don't think that going into the kind of digital revolution, people thought, I'm going to write more letters than I ever wrote in my life previously. Well, that's what we're doing in the form of email or social media or text or chat. And of course, it's much more pervasive because digitally you can broadcast it to a much broader audience. So we focus on language. And essentially what we try to do is apply the cognitive capability that human beings bring to language. And that is to look for context, meaning, and relationships to understand the language. So in AI, you'll hear, as I mentioned, natural language. And often you'll hear natural language processing, or NLP. Generally, that is a technique that is applied in the machine learning world, and we'll talk more about that. What we do, we believe, is actually a superset of that, and we call it natural language understanding. So going beyond merely processing the language and trying to have that rich, deep understanding that humans bring. And then finally, what does that offer? Given how pervasive language is in the enterprise, it surrounds the enterprise, it powers the enterprise, our interaction with customers, with suppliers, with each other, any language intensive processes and documents, contracts, all of those are areas where our language understanding can essentially provide the ability to pull the signal out from the noise for faster, smarter, and more consistent decisions. That's what we do.
There is a lot of myths around these emerging technologies such as AI and machine learning, etc. So can you set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about the differences between, let's say, symbolic AI and deep learning and machine learning?
You can kind of go down the rabbit hole and never come out. And I think in some respect, the entire name of artificial intelligence has muddied the waters, candidly, right? Because it comes with all of this fraught emotional baggage. The robots will take over the world. And it's pretty obvious why. It's because it's technology trying to emulate the compound, complex intelligence that human beings possess. But at the end of it, it's software. That's it. Yeah. So when you hear artificial intelligence, you're talking about a form of software. And I'll get into deep learning and machine learning, but one of the things that we're really focused on is when you talk about the breakthrough benchmarks of artificial intelligence, we think there's a pretty important one for every business, and that is whether the software is worth more than it costs. The ROI is probably the most important benchmark. And when you get into the difference between, say, symbolic and deep learning or machine learning is a category of technology that is applied primarily to what is called structured data. And that's numerical data. So data on which you can operate, you can perform mathematical operations, right? And machine learning, deep learning is a subset of that, is essentially using very sophisticated statistical algorithms to try to detect patterns and then to perform mathematical calculations that provide predictions. Right? So that's the problem set that they're very good at. So if you think about, for example, a company like Uber, and they're dynamically changing their pricing based on the time of day, the amount of traffic, the availability of drivers, the weather, and they're trying to come up with the optimal pricing. That's a massive amount of structured data, and they have to perform calculations very, very quickly. And that's where machine learning does well. Where we operate is in what's called unstructured data. And I spoke earlier about the complexity of language, right? You can't multiply red times car and have a known outcome, right? And you can't have red and book in the same sentence and know exactly what someone's talking about. It doesn't mean they've read the book or the book has a red cover, right? That would be a speech to text example. So what Symbolic does is it provides an explicit understanding of language relationships in the way that humans do. So we're not performing mathematical predictions about the likely intent of the language we're reading. Instead, we're applying our knowledge of context and meaning embedded and grown over time to the content that we're reading. And so Symbolic was actually the original approach to language understanding. And it's one that we've always maintained is critical for that natural language understanding that we think we offer, that is a deeper element of language technology as opposed to just language processing. And just one final point, I think it's really important for everyone to recognize that all artificial intelligence is knowledge dependent, right? I think, and to the hype that I mentioned earlier, there's somehow this vision that artificial intelligence comes into the world with a point of view, with some embedded capability. And that's not the case, right? The machine learning, the knowledge that machine learning gains is the knowledge that is provided to it through the data, the training data in building a model. So the machine learning, statistical algorithms, however it might be, deep learning, et cetera, you're providing a set of data to it and you're saying, this represents the reality that I'm seeking for you to understand. And then out of it, it goes through a pattern detection exercise, right? Now that can be very, very powerful, as I mentioned earlier, in structured data cases. However, it does make it very brittle, right? So it only knows what the data tells it. And we'll talk more about that when you get into the world of language and the proverbial black box around some machine learning approaches to artificial intelligence, that can be more than a little problematic.
And for business leaders and decision makers listening, just to bring to life what we're talking about here, do you have any use cases of how they are applied and together, and what are their strengths of each of those too, just to help bring that subject to life?
So I mentioned earlier machine learning applied to structured data problems where there's a very large availability of data, right? So in the case of Uber, for example, or think about a recommendation engine for Netflix, right? So you've got hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people every day going to the Netflix site. And every time they watch a movie, that's a data point. That becomes a structured data point, right? And based on what other people who are watching that movie have subsequently or previously watched, you can start to make some statistical predictions around this is a movie you'll likely enjoy, right? So that would be kind of a traditional structured data challenge, right? Dynamic pricing would be another one.
Yeah.
In our world, really what you're talking about is when you have very large amounts of language data that's relatively complex, and the volumes could be in a call center, say speech to text, or it could be complex documents like the claim submitted for an insurance company, or we have a number of customers in the publishing and information world where they're literally getting millions of articles a day. And what we enable them to do is to understand that language, to identify the relevant elements in it, and turn it from unstructured data into structured data, right? In the example of claims, we have quite a few companies in the insurance space. Insurance is a language-driven industry. Might not be obvious to folks, but every policy in effect is a contract.
Yeah.
And as you're looking to assess risk, you're bringing in a lot of information around, say, the condition of a building, the hazard, environmental concerns that might be existing. You have to compile all of that, and then you have to try to make an assessment of what that risk is. The data is presented in the form of language. And then multiply that by hundreds of thousands daily. And the only way of doing it until very recently is to have people reading that language data. What we enable them to do is to apply our technology so that what they're looking at is the critical relevant parts that they need in order to make an informed decision. We're also doing it in a way that ensures there's more consistency. So they're less likely to overlook something that's important that might be contained in that language data.
And earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the word ROI, and I know for any new tech implementation or any new big project, it's going to be ROI. What's in it for me? What value is it going to offer the
Sure.
business? So, what can organizations gain by combining these technologies? Again, just to bring it to life.
Sure. Well, we think that the combination of machine learning and symbolic approaches to language understanding, or knowledge-based approaches to language understanding, which we call hybrid natural language or hybrid NL. To our knowledge, we're one of the very few who offers that capability. Has three pretty immediate benefits that will drive the return on investment for anyone considering adopting this technology. The first is it enables you to take what is now a very complex process, a process that is restricted to the domain of the data scientists, who are relatively scarce, pretty expensive. They operate in a very specialized and technical arena, and to make it accessible more broadly to your business for immediate impact, right? And the combination of symbolic and machine learning enables you to make it domain specific, right? Because if you think, for example, of a progression where you say, I have a customer insight language understanding capability, that's generic. And then you say, I have a customer insight language capability for airlines. Well, you're starting to move into a more specialized domain. And then you say, I have a customer insight language understanding for my airline, with the unique requirements that you bring to bear. And that's where Symbolic excels, because again, it's the embedded knowledge, the ability to capture and embed that knowledge that's unique and relevant to you. Machine learning does very well in the general, when there's lots and lots of data, but that's often not the case for language understanding challenges. The other thing is the combination, and we were very pleased to see this, the combination of machine learning and Symbolic really dramatically reduces the operating cost. So one of the things about machine learning is it can be very computationally intensive. It often runs on graphical processing units. And with Symbolic, you're essentially accelerating the knowledge so you don't have to have as computationally intensive hardware in order to run your AI. And that reduces the overall cost to implement an AI solution. And then the final thing that's really critical, particularly in this, as more and more regulators are looking at AI, is Symbolic offers the ability to have what's called explainability, which is, how did I arrive at this outcome? How did my technology produce a decision that affected somebody's life, one of our customers, suppliers, et cetera, right? Once a week, you're going to see an article about some very unexpected AI-driven outcomes that do not reflect well on the company. With Symbolic, you have an explicit outcome. So it's one that's much easier to control and to explain.
And a few moments ago, you also mentioned black box AI. And for people listening, black box AI models often can find patterns in vast quantities of data and make logical decisions off the back of that. But the black box is essentially an impenetrable AI system that doesn't share how it reached those same conclusions. So can you expand on the black box problem in AI and the problem in scaling existing human biases? Because it's a huge topic right now, isn't it?
It is. And So look, in technology, some black boxes are completely acceptable, right? Yeah. So I'm not exactly sure how my refrigerator runs, but it does. And so I don't really care. And so the black box there, I know it involves electricity and Freon and some other things, right? Maybe not Freon in these days, but with AI, the challenge is you're making decisions that are seeking to emulate decisions and are of the reach, quite often, of decisions that humans make, right? Real world implications. What statistical or machine learning approaches are good at is correlation. So they don't understand causation. This caused that. They simply say this tends to follow that. And the challenge there is it can produce some unacceptable outcomes. And it's extremely difficult to go back and say, why did it produce this outcome, right? And when you talk about scaling existing human biases, right, in the language world, there's a movement to ever larger deep learning language models, right? And they call those large language models. The most recent one that attracted a lot of press is GPT-3, which was released by the OpenAI Institute. And it was essentially trained on the entire contents of the English language internet. And so you can imagine a language model whose view of the world, what it believes to be true, is formed by the content of the internet, is going to be subject to some pretty scary implications.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what's on the internet reflects some pretty toxic, pretty factually wrong things. There's two other outgrowths from that are concerning. One is in the language world, and there's the famous Turing test, I think that you probably heard of, right? And that's a test not for machines to pass, but for humans to fail. And that's when a human believes that the entity on the other end of the conversation is a human being. When a machine can imitate a human language well enough that it can convince somebody it's a human, there's a level of credibility and trust that goes way up, right? And so you can say things that are kind of true or sound true, and they're wrong. But because they're presented in the form of language, it lowers the barrier of skepticism, right? And then the final challenge, and this is another one, is when you have systems like GPT-3, what they do is they actually generate content, right? So that's called natural language generation. And so GPT-3 is taking the contents of the internet, reordering it, and then generating more content. And of course, where's that going? Back onto the internet, right? So you end up in this, this downward quality spiral. And that's why we feel it's so critical to have the kind of capability that we offer with knowledge-based or symbolic AI, where you have embedded knowledge of things you know to.
And everything you were saying there, it just reminds me of every time I go online, and maybe you've just unveiled the reason there's so much diversion and polarization out there at the moment. But I'm curious, is this something that you're helping brands tackle at the moment, these problems that we're talking about?
Well, it's kind of core to our approach, honestly, right? We were born out of a symbolic approach to AI, right? Because we were started all the way back in 1989, and our co-founders, including our chief technology officer, who's a brilliant fellow named Marco Barone, had always believed that symbolic was core to having explainable language understanding. Now, what we've done in particular with the platform that we launched now is we've taken the best of what's out there in machine learning and seen how can the two, how can the whole exceed the sum of the parts, right? So by having the symbolic element or knowledge-based element with the machine learning and some of the capabilities it offers that I spoke to earlier, right? We're doing things like, for example, detecting patterns, but presenting them as explicit captures of knowledge for validation and acceptance. So we're saying, we believe this to be true. Do you agree? And that's the critical human in the loop. And we think that's core. When you get into the world of business decision making and you're talking about complex things like contracts, a misplaced word can cost millions of dollars. And so we want to make sure that we're offering that deep domain knowledge that only symbolic or knowledge-based approaches bring to the table.
Love that. And I think it's so good to talk about all these complex topics in a language that everyone can understand. I really think you've brought it to life beautifully today. But before I let you go, it's time to have a little bit of fun with you now, because you've shared
Sure.
your origin story. What put you on this path, how you ended up at Expert AI. But now I'm going to ask you, what was the soundtrack to that origin story? Is there a particular song or piece of music that has inspired you or just helps you get your head in the zone? If you've got a song and a story for me, we'll add it to the Spotify playlist. How does that sound?
Wonderful. And I'm not somebody who cranks up the music when I wake up in the morning in order to get motivation, but I will share with you one that has been part of the Expert.ai journey.
Yeah.
And it's a song called Prisen Colin Ensign ein Schussel. And it came out in 1972 from an Italian pop singer named Adriano Celentano. And I heard it, probably a month or so after I started working at Expert.ai. So in addition to a just epic driving drum beat and ripping horn section, right? And if you can actually go online to a YouTube video of 1973 when he's performing this song with a woman named Raffaella Cara, right? Just incredible choreography, full commit. But the interesting thing about it that makes it most relevant, in addition to the fact that it's Italian, is it's a nonsense song. And he wrote the song and he did it to make it sound like English, but there's no English in it. The only English in the entire song is all right, 2 words, right?
Wow.
The rest of it sounds like English. And so as an native English speaker, when I listen to it, I'm kind of like trying to capture, what's he saying? And for a non-English speaker, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this guy's singing in English, right? And I think it really kind of captured this whole thing around, you can understand language kind of, but it's still hard. And what our technology enables you to do, without trying to sound too cute, because this is a true story, it enables you to get to that next level, to really understand it. Now, with Prisen Colin Ensign ein Schussel, you can enjoy it without understanding it because it doesn't mean anything anyways. But it's a lot of fun bringing Italian and language together.
Oh man, I absolutely love that. As soon as this interview is over, I'm going to be checking that out. You've got me
I'm telling you
now.
what, it is highly motivational as well. Just as I said, epic drum beat, ripping horns, and then again, the choreography with Raffaella Cara. I think Adriana Celentano is still alive, right? I think he's still with us.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Man, I'll be checking that out. And for everyone listening, I'll add a link to the YouTube video as well. But there's that many different domains now. For anyone wanting to check out Expert AI online, contact your team or carry this conversation on we start today. What's the best starting point?
Sure. I mean, going to our website is probably the most straightforward. And we made it pretty easy, right? It's expert.ai. And from there, you can start to better understand our technology, the fact that language is data, but it's a unique, complex, and distinct form of data. And we're here to help bring that to scale in your enterprise.
Well, I always say at the end of every episode, technology works best when it brings people together. And of course, language does exactly that. But you're
Amen.
doing it in a whole different way with technology. It's phenomenal what you're doing here. I'd love to stay in touch with you and get you back on later in the year, see how this journey's going. And I'll tell you what I thought of that tune as well, which I'm going to be listening to in a moment.
I tell you what, I like my chances on your rating for the tune. It's pretty fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for more than anything for sitting down and sharing your story with me. Thank you.
Neil, thank you very much.
What a great topic and a great guy. I'm all too aware that talking about complex technologies every single day, 365 days a year, can be quite a dry subject for people outside of the tech industry, which is why I always try and add a bit of fun and put it in a language that everyone can understand and understand the business value that technology can offer. And for me, that is one of the many reasons why Walt was the perfect guest and gentleman today. And even before we started recording, we were having a whole heap of fun. And his energy and passion for what he does really shines through. But it's time for me to go check out that song there. He left me with a big teaser. So I will add that to the show notes so you can find it. But remember, you can email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. But now it's time for me to have a little dance in front of my computer before I pack my microphone away. So a big thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.